What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another video. If you don't know who I am, that means you're new. I'm Mark. What's good with y'all? Go check out my other videos. Check them out. Check them out. But first, stay on this one. So, in this video, we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject because, technically speaking, depending how you're defining the word caliber, I have two answers here. So, you guys read the title, you saw the thumbnail. There's no beating around the bush. What is the smallest caliber I would use or trust for self-defense? And why? So, when I say technically speaking, there are two answers that I've chosen here. Uh, it depends on whether or not you're referring to caliber as in the size of the projectile, or if you're referring to caliber as in the whole overall cartridge. So, let's get right into it. Obviously, we got to start off with if you're referring to the smallest projectile size that I would trust for self-defense. The smallest projectile size I would go with technically is a 22, but I am not going with 22 LR. I'm going with 22 Magnum. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with 22 Magnum, it is essentially just a very hot 22 LR. Very, very, very hot, and obviously it's a good bit taller. Now, a lot of people might be wondering, why would I go down to something as little as a 22 Magnum? Well, there are a couple of pros here, and keep in mind, this isn't my first choice or anything in that regards. However, there are some pros to it, and if I absolutely had to, it wouldn't be the biggest deal. For starters, very low recoil. Yeah, that's very obvious. It is a 22 cartridge. Not a 22 LR, 22 Magnum, but still very, very, very low recoil. For those who haven't shot 22 Magnum but have shot the 5.7 round, the 5.7 by 28 millimeter, I would say it's pretty close in recoil. Now, what I will also say is that the majority of firearms that are chambered in 22 Magnum, outside of revolvers, of course, and even the revolvers that are chambered in 22 Magnum, they have a higher capacity than your typical revolver does. But regardless, the majority of firearms, or the majority of semi-auto firearms that are chambered in 22 Magnum, have a much higher capacity than you would imagine. Like, if I'm not mistaken here, guys, correct me if I'm wrong on this, the Smith & Wesson M&P 22 Magnum holds 30 plus 1 in the chamber, and that's just the standard magazine. That is the flush fitting mag. That's absolutely insane. That's insane. So on top of low recoil, you get a phenomenal capacity. No one can take that away from it. But you definitely are going to be getting much better ballistics from 22 Magnum than you would with 22 LR, for example. So that is why I choose 22 Magnum when you're referring to at least the small, or how small the projectile size is. The smallest I would go is a 22 projectile, but it's not going to be 22 LR. It's going to be 22 mag. And of course, this is only referring to handguns, guys. If we're going to be talking about rifles, that's a whole different situation. I might actually do a video in regards to that, just because of the fact that this one is solely for handguns. But if you're referring to, I guess you could say, the smallest overall cartridge, I'm probably going to go with 380 ACP. Now, the reason why I would go with 380 ACP is because there are some firearms that have a pretty good capacity of 380, especially compared to what people in the, for example, 2000s, early 2010s, mid 2010s had, while still being extremely small, which is phenomenal for deep concealment, obviously. I mean, let's look at the Bodyguard 2.0. It holds a 12 plus 1 capacity, or at least it can hold a 12 plus 1 or a 10 plus 1. Regardless, and it's still extremely small enough to fit into your pocket. 380 ACP, while again not my first choice in caliber for self-defense, still would do the job. And some people might be wondering, Mark, didn't you say a good while ago that you really wouldn't get hollow points for your 380 because you don't think 380 has enough penetration to reliably expand? Yes, that is correct. However, I didn't buy these. These were actually given to me. So, it just works out in the end, guys. But overall, if I had to choose between these two, if I had no other option, I just had to choose between these two, you're kind of putting me in a tough spot here, but I'm probably going to have to go with 380 ACP. Some people might be wondering why. You know, my two biggest reasons is because there are more firearms that are widely available chambered in 380 ACP than there are in 22 Magnum. Not saying that there aren't any, however, they're not as widely or mass produced than firearms that are chambered in 380 ACP. But also on top of that, now there are firearms like, for example, the Glock 25 that is available to Americans now, which is no joke, a Glock 19 just chambered in 380 ACP. So if I want to get a fuller size 380, I could do that. If I wanted to get a extremely small one for deep concealment, I could do that. Whereas with the 22 Magnum, you might find a bit of trouble finding multiple firearms that can do both in that situation. But this isn't really any hatred on either caliber. Both calibers are actually fairly neat in their own respective spots. Other than that, though, I do think that about wraps it up for this video. I don't want to keep going in circles here. However, this was a very interesting thought I had that I was like, you know what? This could definitely be a nice short little video that would go into some details about my thought process on what I would use for self-defense or not. But with that being said, y'all make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that bell. When you hit that bell, hit all in. Whether or not you agree with me about my thoughts on what is the smallest caliber I would use for self-defense, although go ahead and comment your thoughts on what would be the smallest caliber you would use for self-defense down below. Make sure to check out all my other videos. Y'all make sure to stay legal, stay safe, stay dangerous. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.